So when we discovered this within our academies, a number of the clubs came to us and said, look, Sean, could we actually have some games where we group children by their biological age or their biological maturity and not just their chronological age? And the idea here is that when we do that, we don't have those big differences like a David versus Goliath situation where you've got a very big player and a very small player, and the big player just dominates the game. Everybody's a lot more similar in terms of their maturity. And those early developing players who've relied upon their physicality, they don't have that advantage anymore. They're playing with older, smarter players who are more experienced, who are also physically matched. They can't just bully them. They have to use their technical, their tactical, their psychological skill sets. It's going to be challenging them for once.
Welcome to FSI Talk, where the best experts in the world come together to talk about football. The title of today's discussion is Growth and Maturation in Football Academies, a crucial topic for everyone involved in football academies, especially that coaches and fitness coaches are shaping the next generation of talents. And understanding these processes of growth and maturation can help to unlock their full potential in a way that promotes long-term success. To talk about that, here we have two of the best experts in the world in this topic, two leading voices in talent, in growth and maturation, Sean, Cumming, and Xabi Monasterios. Welcome to FSI Talk, guys.
Thank you for the invitation.
Same, thank you for having us here.
Okay, first of all, the idea is to give our listener a little brief of your academic and professional background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm a professor at the University of Bath. I've been studying growth and maturation in young athletes for almost 2 to 3 decades now, and I work in a number of different sports, predominantly in football. I work with more importantly, probably the Premier League is most of my work, where we establish growth and maturity screening programs across all of the academies in England to allow people to better understand how fast children were growing, who is early, on time, or late in their development, for both performance reasons, but more recently to look at things such as injury prevention.
Amazing. Incredible. Xavier?
Yes, I'm a physiotherapist. Now I work in athletic club in Bilbao. And my PhD, which I ended it like 2 years ago, was focused in how both growth and maturation affect injury risk in football players, in male football players in athletic club. And nowadays I work like a physiotherapist treating growth-related injuries in academy football players, and also I am the responsible for monitoring growth and maturation in our academy football players. So my main role is physiotherapist for growth-related injuries and yes, monitoring growth and maturation in our players.
Oh, amazing academic and professional background. The first question is easy. It's for everyone, is to understand, to base the topic, is the difference between biological maturation and chronological age.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So when we look at chronological age, we're simply looking at the age of a child based upon when they were born and the time that you're measuring them. And chronological age is important if we're looking at developmental factors such as training age, we're looking at social development, cognitive development, and motor development, all of which follow quite closely with chronological age. Biological maturity, however, is not quite the same. When we're talking about maturity, we're talking about progress towards from conception all the way through to the adult state. And we can talk about it in terms of its tempo, so how fast somebody is maturing, its timing, which is whether somebody is early, on time, or late in their development, but also in terms of their status. So are they pre-pubertal, pubertal, or post-pubertal? And all of those things have an important elements in football. Now, what is an issue is that, yes, well, all children will sort of progress together in terms of the chronological ages in tandem. Biological maturity is very much dependent upon genetics and a bit of our environmental factors as well. And we can get huge individual differences in biological maturity amongst children of the same age. So within some of the professional football academies, we may have 2 children, say at 9 years of age, But biologically, in terms of the maturity, one may be biologically 12, whereas another might be biologically 6 or 7. And this has big implications, not just for performance, but also for injury risk. Now, as I said, if we're looking at chronological age, that's important, as I said, in terms of more skill development, technical, tactical. And the differences in chronological age can show up very early at the ages of about 5 or 6. If we look at relative age effects, for example, we'll see those very early in the academies. For differences in biological maturity, they become more important later on during puberty, around 11 or 12. And so important to differentiate between age and maturity and recognize those differences.
Question is, what is the difference between biological maturation and chronological age from your point of view?
Okay, I think that Sean mentioned the key aspects of this. So the problem is that some players may be the same chronological age in the same age group. I mean, the categories in football are classified mainly according to chronological age. So according to at which age or at which year the players were born. But the problem is that even if players may be 1 year older or younger, depending on the month they have born, the differences in biological age may be much wider. So maybe 3 or 4 years in some cases. So that's why monitoring both chronological age and also biological age is really, really important in football academies.
Okay, now I would like to talk about the metrics that assess the biological maturation. For you, what is the metrics, the main metrics that assess biological maturation?
Okay, I would say that the best method to monitor maturation in football academies is monitoring somatic maturity. I mean, maturity can be assessed in the different systems biologically, sexual maturity, skeletal maturity, and also somatic maturity. Sexual maturity is not usually assessed due to ethical reasons, although we monitor, for instance, age at menarche in our girl players. Some years ago, we used to monitor also skeletal maturity. The problem with skeletal maturity is that it is really expensive, really time consuming, and even if the radiation is not a big problem, or at least here in Spain, doing an X-ray is not a problem. It's really time consuming and really expensive, and that's not allowed to monitor and repeat the measurements during the whole maturation process. So I think that the best method to monitor maturity is monitoring somatic maturity. So measuring the height, weight of the players, and we have like different methods or equations to monitor somatic maturity. But as Sean mentioned before, the key thing is monitoring maturity status, timing, and tempo. But in terms of somatic maturity status, good study if the player is so before peak height velocity or the quickest growth rate, circa peak height velocity or around this period, or post peak high velocity. If peak high velocity has already occurred in the player. Then in terms of timing, we classify the players as early, on time, or late. So if the peak high velocity has occurred before the usual age for this population, around this age, so on time or later. And then the tempo, as mentioned before by Sean, measures how quickly maturity is processing. So that's what I think is the best way to monitor maturity. Measuring somatic maturity. Also, age at menarche is important in female players, and monitoring all status, timing, and tempo is really, really important. I don't know what you think, Sean.
Yeah, I would very much agree with what Xabi has said there. In the Premier League academies in England, we are measuring the children in terms of height and weight every 3 to 4 months. And when they move into the growth spurt, a number of the clubs will measure every 6 weeks or so, because at that point of time, children can grow quite rapidly. And needing to be aware of how rapidly they're growing, Xabi's research has shown that it's not just the growth spurt that's a risk factor for injury, it's how fast they're growing through the growth spurt at that point of time. So certainly in England, we're measuring largely looking at somatic maturation, and we're looking at the Camas-Roche method, which gives us a percentage of predicted adult stature as being an indicator of whether one is early, on time, or late. And it can also help us identify when the children are going through the growth spurt. We see that most children will take off in the growth spurt around 85% of adult height, peak usually around 90 to 91, and then come back down at 90 to 90, well, 95, 96% of adult height. It is important, however, with all methods that you're using to assess maturity is to recognize the limitations of those methods. And this is why it's important to look as many factors or sources of information as possible. So you can eyeball a kid and look at a kid, and if you understand how growth occurs in terms of the distal to proximal gradient, that children get the growth spurt in the feet and then the legs, and then eventually the torso, and the changes that occur during puberty, then you can get further information in terms of understanding where a child is in their development. So it's not just the numbers in terms of the maturity indicators, but does this match up with what we're seeing? Does this match up with the current growth rate as well? Childhood growth is very steady. You're looking at about 3 to 4 centimeters per year, 2 to 3 kilograms per year. And the growth spurt, that 7, 12, 20, it could be really, really high at certain points of time. Other good sources of information are the coaches. Coaches will often, because they spend a lot of time with the children, be the first people to notice that a child has suddenly shot up and grown, or maybe they're showing some aches and pains. It might be the physio who identifies the growing pains. And gathering as much information as possible can be really, really useful. So there are good methods out there, but try and collect as much information as possible to inform those decisions.
Okay, let's talk about now the page B, the peak A velocity. In this moment, what do you think that are the main changes that coaches can observe from anatomic, emotional, or behavioral point of view?
Okay, regarding anthropometrics, I think that the main things are the things mentioned by Sean. So kids are growing really, really, really quickly. So sometimes the legs look like really long relative to the torso because the growth starts from the distal segments of the body. So then the feet grow, then the legs, and then the trunk. So relative to the torso, the legs look like really, really, really long. So that's one of the key things to detect those players that are growing really quickly, apart from the different methods that we have to monitor growth and maturation. Then in terms of performance, sometimes coaches can see that the performance of the kids is not as good as it was before. Maybe some changes in coordination, maybe the player loses some balls that didn't occur earlier. So maybe the performance is impaired for the period around peak high velocity. And then it can also affect in terms of emotions. I mean, it's not easy for the kid to be not as coordinated as he was before, or to have a lower performance compared to their previous performance before peak high velocity. But I think that the key thing is that they have to understand that it's something that will happen or occur or end up in some months or years. So that's something transition, I would say. So it stops after peak high velocity. So it's really, really important to make the coaches understand that it's not something that will be like this for the whole process of the football player.
Yeah, something else you will see is some dramatic changes in terms of physical fitness. So certainly at the back end of the growth spurt, and I guess with speed at the start of the growth spurt, we start to see a big acceleration in speed as the boys start to get bigger, taller, longer limbs. But as soon as they start to put on that lean mass on the back end of the growth spurt, that's where we see big accelerations in strength, speed, and power. And of course, the boy who goes through this at the ages of 11 or 12, the early developer, will then be like a young man. He will have a big advantage over the boys who have not gone through it at this point of time. So although it can present challenge in terms of issues around adolescent awkwardness, it can also present advantages once a child has actually gone through those phases. Of interest, what Xabi was talking about with adolescent awkwardness, we actually explored this at Southampton's Academy. We looked at 5 years worth of historical data, looking at match grade performances. And what we found was that actually when the boys are going through the growth spurt, we see a dip in the match grade performances, and then they come back out of it afterwards. So it's really important if you're a coach or you're working in an academy to be aware not just who's early on time or late, but also is a boy in the middle of the growth spurt. Because sometimes that dip in performance may be simply due to the temporary disadvantages of going through rapid periods of growth. And I know that clubs such as Southampton now will try not to make a decision or a scholarship decision on a boy when they are in the middle of the growth spurt, because they often don't know what they're going to see. A perfect example of this was Gareth Bale, who eventually went on to play for Real Madrid. He was with Southampton's academy. Very late developer, went through his growth spurt at 15, had been a standout player in the academy, and all of a sudden didn't look as good as he used to be. Now, there was a lot of decisions about whether they would scholar him at that point of time and keep him, and he was one vote away from being cut. Fortunately, it was the physio Mo Gimple who flagged up the fact that he was in his growth spurt, spoke to some of the advisor at the Football Association, and they adapted his training program, working on core strengths, balance, coordination, giving him that time to adjust to those changes. And it took a bit of time, but after about 6 months or so, he was back to performing well. So, of course, the last thing you want to do is release a Gareth Bale from your academy. So, recognizing they're in the growth spurt and accommodating for that is really important.
Perfect. For you, I don't know, but what is the frequency to assess the player maturation? Is each season? Is two per season?
We usually do 3 or 4 times per season, so every 3 or 4 months. I know that in other academies, they usually monitor growth like every month. I think that this is madness. I mean, we don't have time to monitor the players every month. The biggest problem is that the measurement error when you measure the players as frequently is huge. So maybe your data is not as good as if you measure the players every 3 or 4 months. So yeah, I measure the players every 3 or 4 months, and I think that it's the best frequency to monitor them. I don't know what you think.
I fully agree with that. When we started our work with the Premier League, some clubs were measuring every week. Children were shrinking. They weren't really shrinking. It was just measurement error that we were seeing. So we set up systems where we trained everybody how to measure accurately, because the quality of your measurements is going to be really important in terms of the quality of the data that you get coming in and the quality of the decisions that you then make. So most clubs, as I said, in England, it's every 3 or 4 months, very much like Xabi is doing in terms of getting measurements. And that will tell them who's advanced, who's delayed, how fast children are growing at that point of time. Some clubs, when it gets to the growth spurt, will measure every 6 weeks. And the reason being is that if you look at the growth spurt, growth is what we call episodic or saltatory in nature. It's not that just we get this lovely curve. It's actually big spikes and then quiet parts, and big spikes and then quiet parts. And of course, if you model that over time, you get a lovely curve. And so I know that from Jan Willem Tunissen's work at Ajax, with some of those measurements, the kids were growing at rates of about 20, 24 centimeters. So with some periods where there was really, really rapid growth. And of course, we know that incredibly rapid growth from Xabi's work is associated with an increased risk for injury. So if you are measuring it every 6 weeks, yes, it can be useful at certain phases, maybe at the peak of the growth spurt, but you need to make sure that the people who are doing the measurement are absolutely fantastically trained so there's as little error as possible. So what you're seeing is really true growth at that point of time.
Okay, let's imagine now a professional context in football, in the academy. First of all, what is biobanding? And it's possible to apply biobanding in competition in professional context in academies?
I'm happy to answer that one. So the biobanding in England first started in 2015, and it was an idea that actually didn't come from myself as a scientist, but it was an idea that actually came from the clubs. They had recognized that when they looked at their academies, there was lots and lots of early developing boys, but from the ages of about 14 and 15 onwards, there were very, very few late developers. But many of those late developers were very talented players and just getting excluded because they weren't physically able to compete at that point of time. So when we discovered this within our academies, a number of the clubs came to us and said, look, Sean, could we actually have some games where we group children by their biological age or their biological maturity and not just their chronological age? And the idea here is that when we do that, we don't have those big differences like a David versus Goliath situation where you've got a very big player and a very small player, and the big player just dominates the game. Everybody's a lot more similar in terms of their maturity. And those early developing players who've relied upon their physicality, they don't have that advantage anymore. They're playing with older, smarter players who are more experienced, who are also physically matched. They can't just bully them. They have to use their technical, their tactical, their psychological skill sets. It's going to be challenging them for once. With the late developers, what we do is we actually have them playing down with younger players who are physically matched. So at this point of time, physicality isn't an issue. We expect the players to command the games. So we decided with the Premier League to actually test out this concept in terms of the bio banding. And we had a number of clubs that participated in the first tournament. And then we had a second tournament the following year with about another 4 clubs who were involved in it. And we evaluated the experiences of the early, the on-time, and the late developers. And what we found was really fascinating. Both the early and developers and the late developers found benefits from the bio banding, but for completely different reasons. The early developers were coming back going, boy, that was difficult, but I needed that challenge. It was important for me. They were very honest. They said they'd relied too much on their physicality. It was a faster game. They had to release the ball more quickly. They had to think more quickly. They couldn't use their physicality. They had to play as a part of a team. In addition, with some of the work at Southampton, we found they were scanning more in these games as well. So it's more of a challenge for them. And these are good attributes we want to develop, which they're not getting in their age group games. In contrast with late developers, yes, they said it was less of a physical challenge, but they were taking on leadership roles. They were commanding the game, getting an opportunity to use their physicality. And also coaches were getting an opportunity to see those early and late developers in different situations and recognize their strengths and their weaknesses. And so since then, we've found that the bio banding is an adjunct format, so something that goes alongside age group competition, is something that clearly benefits the early and late developers and mixes up that challenge. And of course, you see examples of the bio banding with the futures programs that run in Belgium and in Denmark and in Sweden and the Netherlands now, where you can actually group players by maturity to discover those late developers who have that exceptional ability, who might not be the best at 12 or 13 because they don't have the physicality, but 18, 19 or 20, that's going to be your best player. So yeah, bio banding has really come to the fore in England, is generally accepted as part of good practice.
Javier?
Yes. Personally, we don't do bio banding in matches or trainings. Usually, what we do is do bio banded gym training. We are unlucky that the clubs around us are not really familiar with growth and maturation and bio banding, so we don't have the chance to compete against other teams doing bio banded tournament or matches. So what we do is classify the players as pre-circa, post-peak high velocity, do different gym training. I mean, because a boy who is pre-peak high velocity can't do the same as a post-peak high velocity boy in the game. Maybe it's really hard for them, for him, sorry, because a pre-peak high velocity player cannot be doing weights in the game as maybe a post-peak high velocity player can be. We also know that the injuries that occur in pre-circ and post-peak high velocity periods are different. So the gym training should also be adjusted due to the different injury patterns according to maturity status. And I think that it is also not only beneficial for the pre or circa peak high velocity players that are at higher risk of having growth related injuries, but also for those post peak high velocity players that are usually the earliest maturers that maybe are underloaded when doing the same gym training or training as their pre or circa peak high velocity players on their teams that are later maturers. So I would say that is beneficial for all of them. So yes, we do gym bio banded training, but not tournaments or matches. And we also take into account, for instance, when a player is going to train or compete with the oldest players in our academy, we consider maturation and we usually lift those players that are the earliest maturers.
Yeah, just to add to what Javi said there as well, the concept of biobanding for training is something that's very popular in the Premier League academies as well. If you look at clubs such as Arsenal, Southampton, Bournemouth, they've been really leading on practice in this area, following principles very similar to what Javier and is doing at Athletic Club Bilbao. Uh, David Johnson, who is the head of physical development at West Ham, did his PhD with me specifically in this area and was working with the FC Bournemouth. And during a season, they implemented the very same types of programs that Javier is running there at Athletic Club Bilbao for the boys who are in the middle of the growth spurt. And what we did is we had the adapted training focused upon their developmental needs at that point of time, core strength, balance, coordination, and a lot of activities in sock feet or in sort of padded surfaces as well to reduce load on the children. At the end of the season, when we compared it to the previous seasons, we ended up with a 70% reduction in terms of injury incidence and a 92% reduction in terms of injury burden. And these are principles, which are being applied at places such as Ajax. Ajax were doing this 10, 15 years ago and talking about the same kind of benefits. And there's no doubts about it. If you recognize the developmental needs of the child at that point of time, you're a little bit more careful in terms of how you manage them. Undoubtedly, you can have success in terms of reducing injuries. And of course, this is incredibly important because if a child picks up an injury during the growth spurt, well, we know they're probably at more risk for later on injuries, tendinopathies, for example. And so just treating and managing them more effectively during this phase is really important. And this is why, I think Javier's work that he did for his PhD was so incredibly valuable because it really laid down the evidence that, yeah, this is this period of development where we really need to manage the children more effectively, reduce that risk to keep them healthy, not just during puberty, but as adults as well.
It makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. As you say, not two children develop at the same time. The temporary physical discrepancy between early and late developer produce that late maturing young player don't reach to the elite. Late maturity is a real problem in professional academies, mainly because the math result is more valued than player development. If you are coach and you don't win with the under 15 team, you are out of the club immediately. So what is solution we have for the club for protect the late maturity player?
So, from my perspective, the key things that we did in England was education and monitoring and measurement. The first thing is that you need coaches, academy heads, physios, sports doctors. Everybody who's working with a child needs to understand growth and maturation and the implications of being early, on time, or late, so that can help inform their decisions. It's not the most important factor, but it's certainly one factor you need to consider. So with the Premier League, we set up education programs for all of the sports medicine staff, the sports science staff. But at the same time, I was delivering growth and maturation education to all of the coaches through the FA's Advanced Youth Awards coaching. And so that meant that we had an increased level of knowledge and awareness. If you set that up with a growth and maturity screening program, then they have the information. They can tell who's early, on time, and late. And that's certainly important. And I think part of the thing as well is convincing them that it's worth taking a risk on those late developers. Now, for a late developer to survive in the academy, technically, tactically, psychologically, they have to be way, way above the curve because just not to be the best player, but simply to exist. Now, if you allow that player to eventually develop and eventually catch up, then it's only then that you're going to see that they have these superior abilities. Those physical differences between earlys, on times, and lates are largely gone by the time you get to the ages of 18 or 19, but it'll take that length of period of time for actually seeing those players. So if you can showcase examples of late developing players who've been overlooked, who've gone on to succeed afterwards, then that can be really helpful in terms of convincing coaches and clubs. And certainly in the United Kingdom, arguably, I would say probably the most successful manager of all time, Sir Alex Ferguson, really was pioneering this type of work at Manchester United. When he worked with Mandy Johnson there, the physio, they had actually set up a growth and maturity screening program 20 years ago. And they had recognized that, some players were 2 or 3 years biologically younger than their actual age. And he had recognized at that point of time that certain players such as Danny Welbeck, Jesse Lingard, Tom Cleverley, for example, were late developers who might not be the best at this point of time, but had potential in the future. And he flagged up very early that the biggest risk that they took in talent identification was investing in a big physical boy over a much, much more talented late developer who simply wasn't quite there at that point of time. So with that information that Mandy Johnson collected for them there, they actually decided to play players down age groups. So people such as Jesse Lingard, who was almost 3 years biologically younger than his actual chronological age, he played down 2 age groups and he was still one of the smaller boys. And it took time and it took development, but eventually those boys come to the fore. You could look at examples such as De Bruyne, Dries Mertens, Courtois, players who come through the Futures programs. And this is why the Futures programs has really taken off, because it's those late developers who often actually come to the fore as being the best players, but it's maybe 18, 19 or 20. If you look at Denmark's Futures program, the work that Rasmus has been doing up there, Rasmus Pors, if you look at their current squad, I believe they have more players from their Futures development program in their current national team than they actually have from their regular under-16 squads. So often those late developers are the whispering talent that you do not see. And if you can hold on to them, often it pays off in the long term.
Xavier?
Yes, I would say that we are really lucky in our club. I mean, I don't know if you know our club's philosophy, but in our first team players, only players born in the Basque Country or developed in our academy can play. So for us, long-term development is really, really important. That's why maybe we try not to focus as much in winning every competition, and we try to focus more in players' development. Sometimes it's really difficult because everyone wants to win, but I think that one of our, or as the responsible for growth and maturation, for me, one of the things to do is, okay, be patient, and let's try to make make this player a first team player, not try to win every single match. And I think that we talk a lot about those late maturers who are the ones that are released from the academies, but sometimes we also forget that early maturers usually are released from the academies when they are under 17, 18, or 19, because once the other players, the latest maturers, are at the same, let's say, maturational stage or at the same maturity status compared to early maturers, maybe their performance is not as superior as it was before when the early maturers have this advantage. So I think that one of the things that we have to also start to think about is what happens with those early maturers, because losing those players is also problematic.
That's an excellent point that Xabi brings up there, and this is one of the reasons when we introduced the biobanding, everybody thought it was for the late developer. To be honest, the biobanding probably has more benefit for the early developer, because those early developers, they rely too much on their physicality, they get lazy, they get very complacent, and if they don't have those types of challenges from playing up or playing in biobanded tournaments, then they're not going to develop those important elements. So it's as much about, recognizing that talent in the late developers, but also making sure you push and you challenge that talent within the early developers as well. So I think Xabi is spot on with regards to flagging up the concerns around. It's not just about the late developer. If anything, the early and the long term probably has the biggest struggles.
Absolutely. Okay, guys, this is all as being a big chat talking about growth and maturation. To me, it's a big honor to be part of this talk. Thank you, Sean and Xavier, for providing us this highly useful discussion, especially for that in football, because have special characteristics, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Alberto, for that opportunity. It's a pleasure to talk about those things, because I mean it's something I'm passionate about, and talking here with Sean and Johan was a real pleasure.
Yeah, equally, it was a great fun to chat about this. And yeah, anybody who's interested in the growth and maturation as it relates to injury, definitely check out Javi's work. He's done some leading work in that particular area. And it's inspired a lot of change within the academies too, in terms of better understanding when certain types of growth-related injuries are coming and what we can do now in the academies to mitigate that type of risk. Because, as I said, we want to keep the kids healthy during adolescence, but we also want to make sure that they're healthy adults as well. I think it's something that as clubs we have a requirement to make sure that we protect those children.
Absolutely. Okay, that is for today FSI Talk. Thanks for listening. Don't forget that you can find all our episode on our website and on Spotify. See you next time.